The Canary Islands, which belong to Spain, consist of 7 large islands and some small and mostly uninhabited ones. They lie about 115 kilometers off the northwest coast of Africa, on the same latitude as Florida and Egypt. Each of the 7 biggest islands, Tenerife, Gran Canaria, Fuerteventura, Lanzarote, La Palma, Gomera and Hierro, has its own distinctive landscape. The strangest of them is undoubtedly Lanzarote. It's the 4th largest and the easternmost of the islands of the Canary archipelago. Some 300 volcanoes with yawning craters and fissures, frozen rivers of black lava, and acres of ash and clinker characterize the face of Lanzarote. Because of its geographical position in the Atlantic Ocean, its closeness to the African coast, and the influence of the northeast trade winds, Lanzarote has no extremes of temperature. Knowledge of the earliest history of the Canary Islands has been lost in the mists of time, but the colourful legends that have been woven round them more than make up for it. For the ancient history writers, the Canaries were the Elysian fields, the gardens of the Hesperides, or the Paradise Islands, situated at the edge of the known world, somewhere far out in the Sea of Shadows, the Mare Tenebrosum, where Atlas supports the arch of the heavens on his cone-shaped mountain. From Plato's description, one is inclined to identify the archipelago as the remains of the legendary continent of Atlantis, though even he never mentions the islands by name. But one thing is certain, these islands, far away from the civilized world of those times, must have been a happy place. The original inhabitants of Lanzarote can be traced back to about 1000 BC through archaeological excavations. They belonged to the race known as Cro-Magnon man and have been given the collective name of Guanches throughout the Canary archipelago. Until the Spanish conquest, they still used weapons and tools made out of stone. Their clay storage jars and pots were simply but cleverly made purely by hand. As the original inhabitants had no knowledge of reading and writing, the signs that have been found on stones, petroglyphs as they are called, would seem to have a mystical or ornamental significance. Nothing has ever been found to suggest that they knew how to build boats. They were completely isolated by the sea and had no knowledge of iron or the potter's wheel. So they lived for many thousands of years as simple shepherds, alone and forgotten, and themselves without any memory of their origins. Lanzarote emerged from the blind spot of world history at the beginning of the 14th century, when Lancerotto Malocello from Genoa landed here in 1312 and gave the island its name. And it was soon after this, in 1339, that Lanzarote was first entered on a map of the world as Insula de Lanzarotos Marroquelos. It was in the 14th century, once Lanzarote had become known to Spanish and Italian seamen, that the subjugation and Europeanization of the island began. At the beginning of the 15th century, hardly 100 years after the visit of Lanzarotto Malocello, King Henry III of Castile gave the Norman nobleman Jean de Betancourt the order to conquer the Canary Islands, and Lanzarote was the first leg of his campaign of conquest. In 1402, he landed, together with the knight Sir Gadifard de la Salle, at País del Rubicon in the south of the island. Today, this area is dominated by the 18th century fort Torre del Águila, the Eagle's Tower. Betancourt overthrew the local monarchy without bloodshed, putting Lanzarote under the crown of Castile, and launched from here the invasion of Fuerteventura. With that, Lanzarote enters the period of modern history. The most colossal geological changes occurred on Lanzarote on the 1st of September 1730, when over a dozen volcanoes erupted almost simultaneously. This tremendous natural disaster changed the face of the island. There was a chronicler of the tragedy, Don Andres Lorenzo Corbelo, the parish priest of Yaiza, who has left us a moving documentation of the eruptions. He was an eyewitness, but could not know when he began his account that the eruptions were going to last for 6 years without a break. Like all the other inhabitants, he had to flee the fiery flood, but like all the others, he stayed on the island among the rivers of lava and experienced the violent transformation of the place, which could only be faced with fear and hope, until finally the furious unleashing of nature's forces gave way to a breathless calm. What remained was a virgin landscape, as on the day of creation. The climax of any visit to Lanzarote is without doubt the Timanfaya Massif, the Montañas del Fuego, or Fire Mountains, which years ago now were proclaimed a national park. Here the tourist can ride a camel through the desolate crater landscape and admire the work of creation so recently performed, or think with a shudder of the brutal natural cataclysm to which the local people were so helplessly exposed. Anyone who wants to enjoy more than just a view of the colorful panorama of the Fire Mountains can get a personal experience of a volcano at Islote de Hilario. Here, a restaurant has been built on a mountain of volcanic ash that's still hot. A unique feature is the volcanic grill. Here one can toast bread or grill juicy lamb chops over the heat from a natural fissure in the ground. Impressive, too, are the spectacular displays outside the restaurant of the degree of heat still in the ground. Only a foot or so below the surface, the temperature rises to 140 degrees centigrade. Twigs thrown into a small pit burst into flame in seconds. Here one can smell the sulfur fumes from the bowels of the earth, and one's shoes threaten to burn the soles of one's feet if one stands too long in one spot. Especially convincing is an artificial geyser. Into an iron tube let into the ground, a warden pours a bucket of water, which shortly afterwards bursts skywards as a fountain of steam. The volcanic cataclysm that covered the ground with lava and ash seemed to mean the end of agriculture. But wind, sun, and lack of water have always presented a challenge to the inventiveness and hard work of the farmers of Lanzarote. They have learned to defend themselves against the forces of nature and to exploit the solidified lava for their purposes. Under a protective blanket of volcanic ash, they grow onions and other vegetables, tomatoes, melons, vines, maize and wheat. First, the fields of topsoil are carefully prepared. The old wooden plough with an iron foot is still used, though it cannot turn over the soil very deeply. It was found out that the volcanic ash attracts and retains moisture, so the fields are covered with a layer of ash 10 to 20 centimeters thick. In this way, the soil is kept constantly damp even without rain. This method of farming is specifically Canarian and is known as enarenado. The volcanic ash, called picon or lapilli, also has the advantage of a high mineral content and therefore improves the fertility of the soil. The harvest achieved by these unusual means not only gives the farmers enough for their own needs, but also allows them to export a large proportion of the crops. The speciality amongst all of the island's agricultural products is the wine. The vines grow very well in the volcanic soil. Introduced from Crete in 1725, they provide a heavy, amber-colored Malvasia wine, whose quality and bouquet are the result of the hot, dry conditions. The vines are planted in deep funnel-shaped holes called sokos, which are often surrounded by protecting walls made from the lava stones. In this way, they escape the worst buffeting of the trade winds. Also, by pruning, the vines are kept so low that they have developed into creepers. With the planting of vines, the land around La Jeria up to the crest of the surrounding mountains has been turned into one great vineyard. The farmers say that their wine has the volcanic fire in it of which their forefathers were so afraid. bizarre feature of Lanzarote is the no longer very profitable cochineal industry in the area around Guatiza and Mala. The opuntia cactus, or prickly pear, which was introduced from Mexico by the Spanish conquerors, is infested by the cochineal insect. The Lanzaroteans learnt to cultivate these bugs thanks to the chemist Villavicencio, who knew of a use for them. They produce a natural red dye, which is much in demand and is still used today in the carpet industry and in the manufacture of lipstick. The bugs, easily spotted as they are covered in a white powder, are scraped off the thick blue-green leaves. Windmills have always fitted harmoniously into the scenery of Lanzarote, but they're more than just scenic. They bear witness to the daily task of milling the grain and pumping seawater into the salt pans. When the tourists arriving from all parts of the world enter the airport of Lanzarote, they immediately feel a lifting of their spirits. The concourse, painted in green and white and filled with innumerable plants, dispels the stress of traveling through its aesthetic charm. Since about 1970, Lanzarote has emerged from the touristic shadows of its neighbors Gran Canaria and Tenerife, and its first tourist center was developed near the fishing village of Puerto del Carmen. A lot was learned from the errors made on the neighboring islands, and so here, hotel architecture with a human face has been incorporated into the landscape. It was thanks to a Lanzarotean, Cesar Manrique, that the island has been largely saved from ugly buildings and towers of concrete. He insisted, donkeys years ago, that tradition and the beauties of nature are the best capital on which to build the tourist industry. As a result, the tourists can enjoy the most valuable days of the year amidst the harmonious surroundings of a large choice of first-class accommodation, varying from loosely grouped blocks of apartments to spaciously laid out hotels. For those who find sunbathing, swimming and island discovery tours aren't enough, a wide range of sporting activities are available. One can either do what one's good at or else take lessons from experienced professionals.
Laat het gebeuren.
In the south of the island are the picturesque bays with their golden beaches around Punta de Papagayo. This area, which up to now has been protected from development, provides superb bathing and is an oasis of romantic calm. In these surroundings, the sun worshipper finds every opportunity to acquire an overall tan. The holidaymaker who finds the south too far or too difficult to reach, or prefers more company, has the possibility on the long sandy beaches of Puerto del Carmen to enjoy beach life close to the tourist center.
Pasa natural.
If one is still not tired after a sun-baked day, the island nightlife offers countless restaurants, bars, pubs and discos in which to make new friends and swing the light fantastic into the early hours. About half of Lanzarote's 55,000 inhabitants live and work in Arrecife, the island's capital. Most of them work in the fish processing industry, in commerce, or in local government. Arrecife is a jolly, busy town, dominated by its harbours, its many shops and restaurants, and its well-kept parks and gardens along the seafront. It's keen to make progress in both the economic and the cultural sectors, and should be visited at least once during one's stay on the island. Many things recall the days when the island was repeatedly raided by slave robbers and pirates. A witness to those insecure times is the Castillo San Gabriel, which today is an archaeological museum. Together with its bridge, Puente de los Bolas, it's the work of the Italian architect Leonardo Torriani. Situated nearby, but dating from 200 years later, is the Castillo San Jose, built by King Charles III in 1790. After having been renovated under the expert supervision of Cesar Manrique, it's today a place where international art exhibitions are held, and it also houses a top-class restaurant. Thanks to its seashore location and its various well-protected harbors, Arrecife is a natural base for an important fishing fleet. Its fish canning and fish meal factories enable it to export an annual 9,000 tons of fish and fish products. There are also several boatyards round the main harbor, repairing or building new boats for the fishing fleet. Splitting as they do the Gulf Stream into a northerly and a southerly current, the Canary Islands are the center of the world tunny fishing industry. Tunny from both tropical waters and the cold northern seas are caught here. For the feast of Corpus Christi, the streets of Arrecife are decorated with brilliantly colored carpets of dyed sea salt. The night before, the local people spend hours making the imaginative pictures, which are then walked over during the religious procession, as a ritual offering to God. The former capital of Lanzarote was Teguise, which was established in the center of the island because of the constant threat of raids by pirates and slave traders. The heart of the town has remained untouched throughout the centuries. The aloof-looking facades hardly stand out in the rows of houses. Their straight lines are broken only by gargoyles, chimneys and balconies. Through the arrival of the Normans, Basques, Castilians and Andalusians, the architecture took on striking forms. The elaborate Baroque of Andalusia became simpler here, more succinct, more sober. The patrician houses of Teguise combine and refine all the stylistic features of the island's architecture. Crosses cast their shadows. Teguise was the first bishopric in the Canary Islands, and for hundreds of years the bishop lived here. The center of every house is the patio. Grouped around it are the cool, dark rooms, which not only attest to the modest way of life of those that live there, but also become places of meditation and reflection in which past and present are often intertwined. The timple is still made today in Teguise in many workshops. It's a 5-stringed plucked instrument which has the bass string in the middle. Although it's now peculiar to the Canary Islands, it presumably originated on the Spanish mainland, where it's now unknown. Teguise is dominated by the castle of Santa Barbara, which was reinforced in 1596 by Leonardo Torriani, the Italian fortress builder of Philip II. The inhabitants of the island were repeatedly terrorized in past centuries by raids by Moorish, Turkish, Dutch and English pirates. The churches often provided the last place of refuge from these attacks. In their simple lines and lack of adornment, these churches are quite different from the Baroque splendor of the cathedrals on the Spanish mainland, deliberately so, in order to make the raiders think the islanders were poor. Risco de Famara, in the northwest of Lanzarote, is a sheer basalt cliff many kilometers long, rising up to 600 meters and more out of the sea. It forms a natural barrier against the lower-lying clouds blown by the northeast trade winds, and therefore strongly affects the climate of the north of the island. The highest point on Lanzarote is here, the Peñas del Chache, 671 meters high. Owing to its inaccessibility, this raw landscape has remained in its natural state, virtually untouched by tourism. Beyond this mountain ridge lies the garden of Lanzarote, with the fertile valleys of Aria, Magues and Los Valles. Here the peasant style of building has survived virtually intact. The square farmhouses with their flat roofs showing African, Arabic and Andalusian influences. Sun and wind made it necessary to build these white cubes with their thick walls and narrow windows. Aria, forming the center of the region, is situated in the midst of palm trees, reminding one with its luxuriant vegetation of a fertile desert oasis. Here time seems to have stopped. The small tranquil village with its white houses, its masses of flowers, its old eucalyptus trees and shady squares would seem to be the island's answer to the dry and brittle landscape of the south. A landmark in the north is Monte Corona, one of the biggest of the volcanoes. In prehistoric times, the lava from this mountain flowed over the whole northeast part of Lanzarote and out into the sea, increasing the size of the island. The large expanse of lava was covered by the farmers with ash and planted with vines. The caves, called Cueva de los Verdes, were formed during this eruption. In former times, they were used as a refuge from pirate raids, and today they're an attractive tourist spot. Of the nearly 7 kilometers of galleries, 2 kilometers have been opened up and illuminated for visits by tourists. Several passages and galleries lie one above the other, and the roofs and walls are partially covered with a mass of solidified lava drops. This fascinating volcanic phenomenon is the result of the lava rapidly cooling and hardening on the outside, while underneath the burning rock flowed on, melted the older basalt, and pushed out into the sea, leaving the tunnels. Near the coast is the grotto called Jameos del Agua, belonging to the same system of caves. Cesar Manrique designed the restaurant, swimming pool and auditorium set amongst beautifully laid out gardens, one of several brilliant examples on Lanzarote of nature and art forming a close and harmonious partnership. The grotto takes its name from a saltwater lake connected to the sea by underground passages. The tiny albino crabs, white and blind, which live on the bottom of the lake, are a biological curiosity which puzzles scientists even today. 3 centimeters long, these crustaceans are presumably deep-sea creatures, and their presence in this cave has never been satisfactorily explained. One of Cesar Manrique's most beautiful works is the scenic viewpoint Mirador del Rio. It's a successful example of how a building can be constructed to fit perfectly into its surroundings and blend unnoticed with the landscape. From here one has a view of the islands of La Graciosa, Montaña Clara, Alegranza and Roque del Oeste. The only one of them that is inhabited is La Graciosa, which is separated from Lanzarote by the 1.5 kilometers of the El Rio Channel. Mirador del Rio is poised like an oriel window on the crest of the Famara barrier. It's a place of tranquility from which one can enjoy the view of the islands undisturbed. Just as the building blends so well into its surroundings on the outside, so the interior is equally beautiful. It's a symphony of space and materials. The fact that Lanzarote has so far been developed for tourism in a positive fashion is largely due to the energetic and indefatigable work of Cesar Manrique. Born in Arrecife in 1920, he's a painter, sculptor, landscape gardener, and protector of the environment all rolled into one. This independent artist is the island's champion and conscience, and has had a decisive influence on its cultural and intellectual life.
No cabe duda que tratar de salvar una isla, el medio ambiente, la calidad de vida y un mayor nivel de vida es bastante complicado y creo que lo más importante.
To save an island, preserving its environment and the quality of its life is a pretty complicated business. I believe the most important thing is to make a sociological study of the island and find out how far tourist development can go without destroying Lanzarote, as it has destroyed holiday resorts in many other parts of the world. Together with a group of people who have an extraordinary love for this island, I've been fighting over the years to keep Lanzarote unspoiled, and a level has been reached which may be unique in Spain. Just consider Jameos del Agua, Mirador del Rio, and the volcanic route. In a book I published years ago, which is a kind of inventory of the traditional architecture of the island, I've shown architects and builders how attractive it can be to adapt the old styles of building. There's no doubt the time has now arrived to ask oneself where the ceiling on the number of hotel beds should be set so as to prevent the island being swamped by tourists and the environment destroyed. The Canary Islands have become victims of short-term speculation made without thought of the future. But on Lanzarote we have fought this off, because an invasion of speculators and holidaymakers would pose a threat to the unspoiled state of nature on the island, with all its varied animal and plant population. One must try to prevent the same mistakes being made on Lanzarote, while allowing a reasonable growth of tourism at the spots that have been earmarked for it. I find it very important that people all over the world are developing greater sensitivity and showing more attachment to the concept of a higher quality of life and the beauty of their surroundings.
No cabe duda que la isla de Lanzarote vendría una invasión de humanidad, de especuladores, de gente que quiere vivir en la isla, que harían insoportable la vida, el medio ambiente, sobre todo la limpieza de la propia naturaleza, de su arquitectura, de su flora, de su fauna, y esto es realmente lo más importante para el futuro. Tratar de que ya no se haga nada más en la isla de Lanzarote o un aumento muy estudioso en algunos lugares que están ya programados a nivel turístico. Esto creo que es muy importante que lo tengan todos los artistas del mundo, por ser seres mucho más sensibles y tener un mayor amor al concepto de lo que se llama calidad de vida o belleza del propio medio.
To make it possible to survive in this world threatened by radioactivity and the destruction of the environment, everybody has an important part to play. Not only ecologists at the political level, but each and every one of us in the attitude we take to our own life. To live on this planet is for me an extraordinary wonder, which must be protected so that something as unique as the wisdom of nature will not be destroyed.
Para que no estropeen algo tan maravilloso como la propia sabiduría de la propia naturaleza.
Orsula is a little fishing village tucked away at the north of the island. Here one can experience the hard and simple life of the fisherman at first hand. One can also cross in a small boat to the offshore island of La Graciosa and visit the village of Caleta del Cebo. Those who want to get to know Lanzarote's southern neighbor, Fuerteventura, can catch a car ferry at Playa Blanca on the south coast. The village can boast a modern yacht marina, a magnificent sandy beach, a most attractive promenade, and some tourist accommodation. The place is also a popular destination for trips by the local population, especially at weekends, when they go out to one of the country-style restaurants to drink wine and eat fresh fish and relax after a hard week's work. On the west coast, not far from the Fire Mountains, lies the emerald green lake of El Golfo. On the landward side, it's edged by the steep cliff face of half a volcanic crater, whose other half has been almost totally worn away by the pounding of the sea. It's separated from the sea by a high beach thrown up by the waves and fed by seawater which seeps through. The color of the green, strongly salty water is due to algae living in the lake. Not far from El Golfo, where the Atlantic surges and seethes, are the boiling cauldrons of Los Herederos, a spot where once lava flowed straight into the sea. The forces of nature have eroded holes and tunnels out of the rock in which the elements rage. Also on the west of the island, near Janubio, are the salt pans. Here, an area of natural lagoons more than 1 square kilometer in extent has been divided into innumerable rectangles. These are allowed to fill with seawater, which evaporates, leaving a layer of salt. The salt needed for the conserving and processing of fish is produced here in large quantities. This area of geometry between land and sea, filled with light made up of crystalline reflections, is not only a fascinating subject for tourist cameras, it also inspired, many years ago now, the Lanzarotean poet Agustín de Espinosa to flights of poetic fancy. A few kilometers inland from the huge salt pans, on the edge of a sea of lava which swallowed up several villages, lies the village of Yaiza, whose whitewashed houses give it an African look. It's not only considered one of Lanzarote's prettiest villages, it's won a prize as the most beautiful village in all the Canaries. It's a textbook example of how old buildings can be renovated and the historical character of a place preserved. Despite the fact that people on Lanzarote are intent on preventing any centers of mass tourism being built like those on neighboring islands, modern city dwellers plagued by bustle and noise are feeling more and more the magnetic attraction of this mysterious island. It remains to be hoped that Lanzarote's deeply rooted traditions will not pass into oblivion as a consequence. It's still possible to fall under the spell of its wildness and harshness, with nature producing intoxicating chords on her keyboard of color, and the islanders responding with their characteristic song, passionately and at the same time romantically sung, the Folia.